I met Daniel at his mother's church during one of those special guest speaker services where everyone pretends to be extra holy for the visiting pastor. He was sitting in the back pew, looking politely bored, clearly there out of obligation rather than genuine faith. But God help me, he was gorgeous, dark hair, strong jawline, and this way of carrying himself that screamed confidence without arrogance. I spent most of the service stealing glances at him instead of listening to the sermon about spiritual warfare, which seemed fitting considering the battle I was already planning for his soul. After the service, his mother Catherine introduced us during the coffee and fellowship hour. She was beaming with that hopeful look mothers get when they think they've found someone who might finally settle their wayward child down. Elena, this is my son Daniel. Daniel. Elena is one of our most devoted parishioners. I could see him trying not to roll his eyes at his mother's obvious matchmaking attempt, but he was gracious enough to shake my hand and make small talk about the weather and the guest speaker's message. When I asked what he thought about the sermon on spiritual warfare, he gave me this completely honest answer that should have been a red flag, but instead made me want him even more. Look, I'm not a believer. I don't know if I'll ever be one, but I respect you and your faith. Most guys would have lied or tried to impress me with fake religious knowledge. But Daniel just laid it out there like he was discussing his preference for coffee over tea. I found his honesty refreshing. Even if his spiritual state was clearly in need of serious intervention, we started dating a few weeks later, and I'll admit I was already planning our wedding and his eventual conversion in my head. Daniel was everything I thought I wanted in a husband. Stable job, close to his family, respectful of my beliefs even if he didn't share them. The only problem was my church family's reaction to our relationship. They kept asking pointed questions about his salvation status and making comments about being unequally yoked that made me want to scream. And Sister Margaret actually had the nerve to suggest I was compromising my witness by dating an unbeliever, as if she had any room to judge considering her own daughter's 3 divorces. The criticism got so bad that I eventually left that church and found a new one across town that advertised itself as welcoming and inclusive. Daniel supported my decision completely, even helped me move my Bible study materials and religious books to our new apartment. Never once complaining about the drama or suggesting I was overreacting. He was actually more understanding about the whole situation than my so-called Christian sisters had been, which should have taught me something about who really had Christ-like love in their heart. We got married 2 years later in a beautiful Catholic ceremony that Daniel agreed to, despite his lack of faith. Watching him stand at that altar in his perfectly tailored tuxedo, promising to love and honor me before God and our families, I felt like I'd won some kind of spiritual lottery. His brother Michael stood as best man, and I remember thinking how blessed Daniel was to have such a close relationship with his family. Michael was charming and funny during his speech, talking about how Daniel had always been the responsible one who looked out for everyone else, and how lucky I was to have found such a devoted man. The first year of marriage was everything I'd dreamed of, except for Daniel's continued resistance to spiritual growth. I'd invite him to church events and Bible studies, leave Christian books on his nightstand, play worship music during dinner, but nothing seemed to penetrate that wall of polite disinterest he'd built around anything religious. He'd listen to my stories about Sunday services with the same patient attention he gave his mother's gossip about the neighbors, nodding in all the right places, but clearly just waiting for me to finish so we could talk about something else. It was frustrating beyond belief. Watching this man I loved so much remain spiritually stagnant while I was growing in my faith and understanding of God's will for our lives. I'd pray for him constantly, asking God to soften his heart and open his eyes to the truth. But Daniel seemed perfectly content in his state of willful ignorance. Sometimes I'd catch him checking his phone during my longer explanations of Pastor William's sermons, or see that glazed-over look in his eyes when I tried to share what God was teaching me through my daily devotions. By our 2nd year of marriage, I was starting to feel genuinely lonely in my spiritual journey. Daniel was a good husband in all the practical ways. He worked hard and helped with housework, remembered anniversaries and birthdays, never raised his voice or made me feel unsafe. But there was this huge part of my life, the most important part, that he couldn't or wouldn't connect with, and it left me feeling like I was married to a stranger sometimes. That's when I started confiding in Michael about my struggles. He'd always been friendly during family gatherings, asking thoughtful questions about my faith and seeming genuinely interested in my perspective on spiritual matters. Unlike Daniel, Michael had been raised Catholic and still attended Mass occasionally, so he understood the importance of having a partner who shared your deepest values and beliefs. When I mentioned feeling isolated in my marriage, He was incredibly sympathetic and supportive. The conversations with Michael started innocently enough. Discussions about faith and marriage, and the challenges of loving someone who doesn't share your spiritual convictions. He'd listen with such genuine concern and offer insights that Daniel never could, having walked away from his childhood faith years ago. Michael understood the hunger for spiritual connection that Daniel seemed incapable of feeding. And gradually, our talks became the highlight of my week. I started looking forward to family gatherings, not to see Daniel's parents, but to have those deep, meaningful conversations with Michael about God and purpose and the loneliness of feeling spiritually mismatched in marriage. He'd seek me out at parties and dinners, asking how I was doing with such sincere care in his eyes that it made my heart race in ways that probably should have worried me more than they did. The people at my new church were incredibly supportive during this difficult time in my marriage. When I shared my struggles with some of the prayer group ladies, they were full of wisdom about the spiritual warfare that happens when believers marry outside the faith. Sister Janet told me something that really resonated. The devil is in you. Elena, Daniel is the reason you're struggling spiritually. It was like a revelation, understanding that my husband's lack of faith wasn't just affecting him, but was actually creating a spiritual blockage in my own relationship with God. Armed with this new understanding, I started praying more fervently for deliverance from the spiritual oppression I was experiencing in my marriage. I also started drinking a little more wine with dinner, just to take the edge off the constant tension I felt, trying to live a godly life while being married to someone who couldn't understand or support my spiritual needs. Daniel noticed the increased drinking but didn't say anything, which was typical of his conflict-avoidant personality. The physical relationship with Michael started almost by accident. We were talking after one of Catherine's birthday parties, and I was explaining how isolated I felt in my marriage, how desperate I was for someone who could understand the spiritual dimension of love that Daniel seemed incapable of providing. Michael held me while I cried, and suddenly we were kissing. And it felt like coming home after being lost in the wilderness for months. I knew it was wrong according to conventional morality, but there was something so right about finally connecting with someone who could meet all my needs, emotional, spiritual, and physical. Michael understood me in ways Daniel never had, never could. When we made love, it felt like a communion of souls, not just bodies. We'd pray together afterward, asking God to bless our connection and help us navigate this complicated situation with wisdom and grace. The affair continued for several months, and honestly, it saved my sanity. I was finally able to be my complete, authentic self with someone who appreciated every aspect of who I was. Michael and I would meet at his apartment when Daniel was at work, spending hours talking about scripture and theology and the deeper meanings of love and commitment that Daniel was too spiritually immature to grasp. I felt more alive and connected to God during those afternoons with Michael than I had in years of marriage to Daniel. I even went to confession about the relationship, explaining to Father Rodriguez how trapped I felt in a spiritually barren marriage and how God had provided Michael as a source of the connection I desperately needed. The priest was understanding about the complexity of the situation, acknowledging that sometimes God works in mysterious ways to meet our deepest needs. When Daniel asked what I'd confessed, I told him it was between me and God, which was absolutely true. The whole situation might have continued indefinitely if Daniel hadn't decided to come home early from work that Tuesday afternoon. I was in our bedroom with Michael, finally experiencing the kind of intimate spiritual and physical connection that marriage was supposed to provide. When I heard Daniel's key in the front door, we scrambled to get dressed, but there wasn't enough time. And suddenly Daniel was standing in our bedroom doorway, looking like someone had just told him his entire family had died in a car accident. "It's not what it looks like," I said automatically, even though it was exactly what it looked like, and we all knew it. Daniel just stood there for the longest moment, his face cycling through confusion, hurt, and then this terrible cold fury that I'd never seen before. Michael was trying to explain, saying something about how these things just happen, and Daniel should try to understand. But Daniel wasn't listening to either of us. What happened next was completely out of character for my usually calm and controlled husband. Daniel launched himself at Michael with this primal scream of rage, and they went crashing into the dresser, knocking over my jewelry box and the framed wedding photos. I was screaming for them to stop, but Daniel was hitting Michael over and over, calling him names I'd never heard him use, completely out of control in a way that was honestly terrifying. When he finally stopped, Michael was bleeding from his nose and mouth, and Daniel's knuckles were scraped raw. He looked at both of us with such disgust and said, "Get out of my house." both of you. Now, his voice was completely flat and emotionless, which was somehow worse than if he'd been screaming. Michael left immediately, barely pausing to grab his shirt and shoes before rushing out the front door. I tried to talk to Daniel, to explain how we'd gotten to this point, and help him understand that this wasn't some sordid affair, but a genuine spiritual connection that had grown into something beautiful. But he just kept repeating, "Get out of my house," like a broken record, not listening to anything I was trying to tell him. I spent that night at Michael's apartment, and we talked for hours about what this meant for our future. Michael was worried about Daniel's reaction, afraid his brother might never forgive him, but I reminded him that real love requires sacrifice and courage. We'd found something precious together, something that transcended conventional marriage vows and social expectations. Surely Daniel would eventually understand that what we had was bigger than his hurt feelings. The next morning, I went back to the house with my Bible, ready to have a real conversation about forgiveness and the complexity of human relationships and God's plan for our lives. Daniel was in the kitchen drinking coffee and staring out the window like he hadn't slept all night, which he probably hadn't. Real couples who say their vows in church work through things like this, I told him, opening my Bible to the passages about forgiveness that I'd marked the night before. Everyone cheats, Daniel. At least it was with someone you knew and not some stranger from a bar. He looked at me like I was speaking a foreign language. Everyone cheats. The fact that I hid it from you for so long shows how much I loved you, I explained patiently. If I didn't care about your feelings, I would have flaunted it or asked for an open marriage or just left you. But I was trying to protect you while still getting my needs met. That's love, Daniel. Protecting me, he repeated in that same flat voice from the day before. I could see he was struggling to understand. So I tried a different approach. We made vows before God in his house. Those vows mean something. Daniel, they mean we work through the hard times instead of just giving up when things get complicated. Any priest would tell you that forgiveness is the foundation of Christian marriage. Daniel stood up from the table and walked to the front door. Holding it open, pack your things and leave. That was it. No discussion. No willingness to work on our problems. No recognition of the sacred commitment we'd made to each other and to God. Just this cold, final dismissal. Like our entire marriage meant nothing to him. I tried to reason with him over the following days, calling and texting and even showing up at his work. But he'd made up his mind with typical stubborn determination to be the victim instead of taking any responsibility for his role in driving me to seek connection elsewhere. The family reactions were predictably dramatic and unfair. Daniel's mother, Catherine, cried for days about her boys and kept begging me to tell her how this could have happened to her perfect family. His father, Robert, was furious and immediately took Daniel's side, cutting off all contact with Michael and treating me like I was some kind of monster, instead of a woman who'd been trapped in a spiritually unfulfilling marriage. My own parents were split in their response. Mom kept talking about forgiveness and healing and how marriages go through rough patches that can make them stronger in the end. She understood that Daniel's lack of faith had created an impossible situation for me, and that I'd been doing my best to make things work, despite his limitations. Dad was less sympathetic, actually having the nerve to suggest that Daniel should have been keeping his wife satisfied if he didn't want her to stray. Like this was somehow about sex instead of the deep spiritual connection I'd been missing. The extended family reactions were a mixed bag of judgment and misplaced sympathy. Daniel's aunt actually told me, "At least it was your brother-in-law and not some stranger," as if that was supposed to be comforting. Some cousins took Daniel's side immediately, acting like I was the first woman in history to have an affair, while others were more understanding about the impossible position I'd been put in, trying to maintain a godly marriage with an unbeliever. Daniel filed for divorce within a week, hiring some aggressive lawyer who treated me like a criminal instead of a wife who'd made one mistake in an otherwise devoted marriage. The legal proceedings dragged on for months because I wasn't going to just roll over and let Daniel keep everything we'd built together. He wanted to keep the house, the car, all our shared assets, just because he was the one filing for divorce. But that wasn't how marriage worked. I'd invested just as much in our life together, and his spiritual immaturity didn't entitle him to punish me financially. The whole divorce process was exhausting and expensive and completely unnecessary. Any reasonable person would have tried counseling first, or at least had some honest conversations about what had gone wrong and how we could fix it. But Daniel was too proud and hurt to consider that maybe, just maybe, his own behavior had contributed to the breakdown of our marriage. During this time, Michael and I tried to build a real relationship outside the secrecy and complications of the affair. We'd found something beautiful together, something worth the pain and chaos it had caused, and we owed it to ourselves to see where it could go. Michael got his own place after Daniel made it clear he was never welcome at family gatherings again. And we started talking about a future together once my divorce was finalized. But the pressure from the family drama and Daniel's complete rejection of any reconciliation started wearing on Michael in ways I hadn't expected. He became distant and moody, second-guessing our connection and wondering out loud if we'd made a terrible mistake. The spiritual intimacy that had drawn us together in the first place seemed to evaporate under the weight of everyone's disapproval and judgment. 6 months after Daniel discovered us, Michael told me he thought we should take a break to figure things out and let the dust settle with his family. It was devastating, realizing that the man I'd sacrificed my marriage for didn't have the courage to stand up for what we'd built together. He was more worried about his relationship with his brother than he was committed to the love we'd found, which showed me exactly what kind of man he really was underneath all that spiritual talk. The divorce was finally finalized over a year ago, and the settlement was completely unfair. Daniel got to keep the house we'd bought together, most of our shared assets, and his precious victim status, while I got my car and personal belongings and the privilege of starting over from scratch at 32. The judge didn't seem to care that Daniel's spiritual limitations had created an impossible situation for me, or that I'd tried harder than most women would have to make our marriage work, despite his fundamental inability to meet my deepest needs. Daniel's thriving now, according to the family gossip that still reaches me through Catherine's occasional guilty phone calls. He's going to the gym regularly, reading self-help books, seeing a therapist to work through his trust issues, and generally playing the role of the wounded but resilient ex-husband to perfection. Everyone acts like he's some kind of inspiration. This poor man who's rebuilding his life after his terrible wife betrayed him, when the truth is that his emotional unavailability and spiritual immaturity created the conditions that made my affair inevitable. Michael tried to reach out a few months ago, suggesting we grab coffee and talk about everything that happened, but I wasn't interested in rehashing ancient history with someone who'd proven himself to be just as weak and unreliable as his brother. He'd had the chance to choose love over family approval, and he'd failed spectacularly. Some people just don't have the courage to fight for what really matters. The family is permanently fractured now, which breaks Catherine's heart, but was probably inevitable given Daniel's all-or-nothing approach to conflict resolution. He refuses to attend any gathering where Michael might be present, forcing everyone to choose sides or plan separate celebrations for holidays and birthdays. Robert supports Daniel's position completely, treating Michael like he's dead to the family, while Catherine tries desperately to play peacemaker from the middle. I've been going to a new church across town, one where nobody knows my history or feels entitled to judge my past mistakes. The pastor there preaches about grace and redemption and second chances, which is refreshing after years of dealing with the conditional love and impossible standards of Daniel's family and my old church community. I'm slowly rebuilding my life and learning to trust God's plan for my future, even when that plan looks nothing like what I thought I wanted. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if Daniel had been willing to work on our marriage instead of just giving up at the first sign of trouble. If he'd been open to counseling, or couples Bible study, or even just honest conversations about what we both needed to feel fulfilled and connected. But that would have required him to acknowledge his own shortcomings and take responsibility for his role in our problems. And Daniel's never been good at that kind of self-reflection. The loneliness is the hardest part of this new life I'm building. Not just the absence of a partner, but the way my entire social world collapsed when the marriage ended. Mutual friends chose sides. Family relationships became awkward and strained. And I lost the sense of belonging that comes with being part of a couple in a world designed for pairs. Most days I'm fine, focused on work and my new church community and the future I'm creating for myself. But some evenings, the silence in my apartment feels overwhelming. I've learned a lot about people's true characters through this whole experience. Who has the capacity for forgiveness and grace, and who's more interested in judgment and taking sides. Daniel's shown me exactly who he is underneath that nice guy exterior, someone who's more committed to being right than being loving, more interested in punishing mistakes than understanding them. His family's rallied around him like he's some kind of saint, conveniently forgetting that it takes two people to destroy a marriage. The truth is, I gave Daniel the best years of my life and tried everything I could think of to make our relationship work, despite the fundamental incompatibility of our spiritual lives. I was patient with his lack of faith, supportive of his career, devoted to his family, and committed to our marriage vows, even when those vows felt like a prison. When I finally found someone who could meet all my needs, emotional, spiritual, and physical, I tried to handle the situation with as much discretion and love as possible. Maybe I made mistakes in how I handled things, but my heart was in the right place. I was trying to save my marriage while still getting my needs met, trying to protect Daniel from unnecessary pain while finding the connection I desperately needed to survive in that relationship. If he'd been willing to forgive and work together on rebuilding what we'd lost, we could have come through this stronger and more honest with each other. Instead, he chose pride over love, judgment over grace, and punishment over redemption. That's his loss. Ultimately, someday he'll realize what he threw away when he refused to fight for our marriage. But by then, it'll be too late to undo the damage his stubbornness caused. I've moved on, and I'm building a better life without him. Surrounded by people who understand that love is complicated and forgiveness is divine and everyone deserves a second chance at happiness. The pastor at my new church says that God can redeem any situation, turn any mistake into a testimony of his grace and mercy. I'm holding on to that promise as I navigate this new chapter of my life, trusting that the pain and chaos of the past few years will eventually make sense as part of a larger plan I can't see yet. Daniel may have given up on us, but God never gives up on his children, and neither do I.